Some of the best ghost stories start close to home. My family has lived for the past 3 generations on the flanks of Mount Reed, the great pile of glacial rubble that most people know as Paddy Hill. Mount Reed is purportedly the most haunted place in Monroe County. Numerous stories of ghosts, specters, spirits, and other bizarre events go back centuries there. Today we think of Mount Reed as a suburban height, a place surrounded by 50s and 60s tract houses and Greece Arcadia High School to one side. But when the first settlers came there, it was not just the tree-lined wilderness we usually think of in this region. No, the north flanks of the hill were a great marsh, the backwaters of the ponds on the south side of Lake Ontario. According to some traditions, the Seneca believed those swamps were haunted by High Hat, a humanoid monster who would quietly approach children, only to reveal a gaping maw full of huge teeth and devour them. High Hat is associated with many swampy places in the Seneca territory, but there's good reason to believe he would have found those back bays a most familiar place. Other early tales tell of little people along the sides of the hill. Now, there are multiple little person traditions in the region. Again, the Seneca spoke of them, but so too did the Irish. And for us today, the name Paddy Hill tells us that it was a landscape the Irish found to be a good home. Mount Reed takes its name from Nicholas Reed, better known as Judge Reed, one of the first settlers in the area, the owner of a dry goods store, and yes, later on a judge in the town of Greece. Reed settled there along what's now Ladder Road about 1820, and a small community of Irish grew around the crossroads at what's now the north end of Mount Reed Boulevard and Ladder Road. Reed's dry goods store was just to the east of that junction. Being an Irish settlement, the settlers were, of course, Catholic and needed to take communion once a year. In the earliest days, they had to make an annual pilgrimage all the way to Albany to take communion at Easter. Later on, with the foundation of St. Mary's Church and later other churches in the city of Rochester, they were able to travel up the river to take communion there. However, with the community rapidly growing in the late 1820s, Reed was convinced by one of his neighbors, Felix McGuire, to give a chunk of land at the very top of the hill for a Catholic chapel. The original chapel was dedicated to St. Augustine, a wooden building. It was erected in 1829. However, the church we know today, the great Italianate brick structure that is certainly one of the most prominent landmarks of western Monroe County, was erected in 1859. It and its cemetery have been a prominent feature, a highlight one might say, of the hill for 170 years. The early settlers of the Mount Reed area included the Wheelahan family. The Wheelahans have farmed there since the 1830s. And indeed, if you know the area, you'll know that on the north side of Ladder Road, near Dewey, there is still a large farm with a white farmhouse. That's the Wheelahan farm. However, a couple generations back, Walt Wheelahan sold a good chunk of the land for development, including what's today's Wheelahan Drive. My grandparents bought one of the houses on that street in the early 1960s. My mother and her siblings grew up there. They knew Walt Wheelahan. They knew him as a storyteller, a man with a lot of tales about Old North Greece. In speaking with my family, I found out that he did not pass along ghost stories to them. However, the noted ghost story collector Shirley Cox Husted, one-time Parma historian, did collect several ghost stories from Mr. Wheelahan. Wheelahan spoke of seeing ghost lights in the distance. tales of ghost lights go back to the 19th century. An 1887 report in the Mother of Sorrows Church Bulletin talks about them being seen again off in the distance to the northwest, in the direction of what's now Greece Arcadia High School. Walt spoke of seeing them many times. His parents, his siblings, neighbors, they all knew about them. Luminous balls that would float over the landscape, dancing across the dewy grass, and even amongst the gravestones in Mother of Sorrows Cemetery. They saw them on a regular basis, especially on cool, wet evenings. Now, there are those who will tell you there's a scientific explanation. These balls of light are nothing more than phosphorescent gas that are seen above swampy areas. But they really were warnings for High Hat, right? They were lights for the little people. Or were they signs of other ghosts in the area? Walt spoke of a bizarre happening, a series of happenings really, in front of his own house. When he was about 18 years old, he came home one night to find his parents in his bedroom on the second floor. Now, the story as recounted does not tell us how he entered the house, presumably through a side or back door, because of what I'm about to relate. See, his bedroom overlooked the driveway facing towards Ladder Road, the front of the house. And there, he found his parents crouched down in front of the window. As he walked in, they hushed him and signaled him to join them. And they pointed out the window at a strange, dark figure standing at the corner of their driveway and the road. The night was, as was so often the case in this area, cool, misty, fog-ridden, and all they could see was this dark shadow of a man. Long coat, hat, standing there, no apparent legs. He stayed there a while, and eventually just turned and drifted away, back up the hill towards the church and its cemetery. Walt found out from his parents that this was not the first time they had seen this mysterious figure. After this, he too learned to watch for the figure, and they regularly saw him drift down the road, stand at the corner of their driveway where there was a lamp, look at the house, and eventually drift away again. This happened for months, if not years. And in Walt's telling, he eventually just got fed up with it. His parents telling him, no, don't do this. He stormed out the front door, walked down the driveway, and approached the figure. Who are you? Why are you here? And the figure blankly looked back at him, turned away, and drifted back up the road towards the church and the cemetery. They never saw him again. After the Wheelahans sold much of that land for development, these more perhaps explicit ghost stories of the family seem to have come to an end. However, Walt, a storyteller, was a theatrical man, and he had a company of players, the Paddy Hill Players, who put on amateur theater productions in a playhouse in the woods on the northeast flank of the hill. Between the 1930s and the 1950s, there are numerous notes in the newspapers of the day about productions from the Paddy Hill Players. According to the best information that I could find, the playhouse is supposed to have burned down sometime in the late 1950s, and the ruins are allegedly still to be found in the woods at what would be the corner of Paddy Hill Drive and Ladder Road. Surrounded by modern housing developments, there's a wild wood back there. According to the stories, really the playhouse was nothing more than a shack with a stage. However, the company was reasonably successful, and therefore were able to hire a maintenance man who lived on site. The maintenance man was a very neat, very organized person. You could always tell he was there because his bed would be made, his clothing would be neatly laid out, everything would be clean. One day, some members of the company came to the playhouse for a meeting. And they walked in to the office, they saw the bedroom of the maintenance man, and to their shock, his bed was in disarray. This was not like him. Something had to be wrong. So they ran out looking for him and realized he was nowhere to be found. It was not that long before a phone call came in. He'd been in an accident and died. Looking to gather and mourn this friend of theirs, this man who they all knew so well. Everyone gathered again at the playhouse, and as they walked in, they realized the bed was made. No one had been there. Or had they? Now, the spirits of Paddy Hill are many, but the most famous stories are attached to that great historic church. Our Mother of Sorrows, again, goes back to 1859, and its founding priest was Father Maurice. Father Maurice was a Frenchman, a former missionary, and spent decades in service to the parish after he was assigned there. There are a number of interesting stories about him. One is a variation on the classic wandering stranger tale. According to this old story, Father Maurice was awakened in the middle of the night when he heard a knocking on the door of the rectory. Dragging himself out of bed, he lit a candle, went to the door, and found a small girl, no more than 6 years old, who told him to come with her quickly. Her mother was ill and about to pass away, and she needed last rites. Father Maurice did not recognize the girl, but, taking very seriously the call for the last rites, he quickly threw on some clothing and followed the girl out the door. They walked through the woods a great distance. He barely knew the way, but she was clearly comfortable in the dark leading him. After some time, they came into a clearing where there was a lone cabin. As Father Maurice approached the door of the cabin, he realized the girl was no longer with him. He looked around and nowhere to be found. Assuming she must have entered the cabin through a side door, he knocked and was quickly greeted by a middle-aged woman. The woman was surprised. She had not sent anyone at all to get the priest, and she felt fine. However, Father Maurice saw an image of a young girl on the mantle and said to the woman, "Who is that?" "Well, it's my daughter. She died a few years ago." Father Maurice was startled, for it was the young girl who had led him to the cabin. Not wanting to overly frighten the woman, he did not tell her this detail, but he blessed her, left for the church, and made his way home in the dark. The next day, he found out that the woman he had blessed the night before passed away in her sleep. Another old story from the church probably postdates Father Maurice's time, though not by much. Sometime around the early 20th century, the church had grown enough as a parish that it was able to afford a live-in janitor. And one of the janitor's tasks on winter nights was to go down into the basement of the church and stoke the coal-fired furnace. So every night, around midnight, he went down, shoveled coal into the furnace, went back to bed. However, every night when he did this, he started hearing noises above him in the sanctuary. He could hear what sounded like someone tap, 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 walking across the wooden floor. kneeling in a pew to pray, then getting up and approaching the altar. The maintenance man assumed that this was the priest going in to pray late at night. However, he wanted proof. Just something did not quite seem right. So one night, he went down, stoked the furnace. As he did it, he heard the exact sounds he had heard many nights before. Threw the shovel down, ran out of the basement over to the rectory to see if the priest was there or not. And to his surprise, the priest was there in the rectory. "Father, were you just in the church praying?" "No." "Do you regularly go?" "No." And from that day forward, the maintenance man found a different time to go down and stoke the furnace. Many other stories about ghost sightings and noises in the old Mother of Sorrows church continued throughout the 20th century. The most recent one that I've seen documented is as late as 1993, when a group of boys at a sleepover nearby snuck out in the middle of the night and went over to the old church wondering what they might see. And they'd heard these stories before, yeah, right, until they looked into the church and saw spectral parishioners walking around, talking, as if they were at a social. The boys quickly retreated to the home that was hosting the sleepover and hid for the rest of the night. But the most famous of all our Mother of Sorrows ghost stories comes from 1986. I mentioned before that Shirley Cox Husted was a local historian and ghost story collector. In '86, she was approached by a Gannett news reporter who wanted some sort of ghost story to talk about for Halloween. Husted, again an avid ghost story collector, had long wanted to do some serious ghost hunting at her Mother of Sorrows. So she convinced the reporter to join her and a local spiritualist minister to go into the building at midnight. Now, by this time, in 1986, the building was no longer serving as a church. Our Mother of Sorrows parish, of course, had grown greatly in the post-war period and built the massive new building that serves as the church today, which opened in 1962. In 1969, the old church was converted into a library by the town of Greece. So, receiving permission from the town, Husted and her companions went into the church. The first place they went was the bell tower. And there the spiritualist minister stopped and was taken aback. I see a spirit of a man ringing the bell. And, oh, what's this? Is someone's being stoned. Someone's being stoned to death. Well, that was Father Maurice, who, in his time as a missionary in Africa, had almost been stoned to death by the natives. Coming down from the bell tower, still in the upper level of the church, the spiritualist minister, saw a young girl by Husted. The minister began describing the young girl, and Husted quickly realized that it was not a ghost of the parish, but of her own life. The minister was seeing the spirit of a young niece who had died in a fire a few years earlier. Taking this all in stride, the group continued down through the church. The spiritualist minister was shaken as she walked through the floor of the sanctuary, surrounded by spirits, people in 19th century garb, old parishioners. But the most striking moment was when they went down to that basement. From one corner of the basement, the minister tensed. They kept the slaves here. They kept the slaves here. What? I see the spirits of enslaved people. They were here. They were here. Now, there have been stories for a long time that our Mother of Sorrows was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Perhaps confirmation of these old stories is at hand. With this, their little ghost tour ended, but Husted recorded it as being probably the most chilling moment of her life, being in this building absolutely surrounded by the spirits of the past. And it is with that little tale that we end our journey through the haunted heights of Mount Reed. Whether you know it as Mount Reed, Paddy Hill, or nothing more than a pile of rocks, this great hill in North Greece is the most haunted place in Monroe County.